What up, YouTube? Welcome to the channel. I'm back with another video. One of the worst decisions that I've made in terms of business was trusting people, whether it's friends or family members. If you decide to go in business or do any type of business with people, make sure you have documentation. Don't do verbal agreements. That's one of the worst mistakes that I made over the years, doing business. So back in 2010, I bought my first house. I was 28 years old. It was a major accomplishment for me at the time. It was something that I had always, had aspirations to do. So, it was an exciting time for me. Fast forward to 2015, I end up moving away from my hometown, and it was due to a job promotion. So I moved away for 2 years, still own my home, and I decided to rent out my property while I was living in a different state. So one of my tenants happened to be my former manager. He was in the process of, moving from his current place, and he was looking for another house to stay in, as opposed to, an apartment. He wanted to rent a house. So I had mentioned that I was getting ready to put my house on the market for rent. And so he was interested. We set up a viewing. He checked out the crib, and he wanted to rent it. So we made it happen. But here's the mistake I made. With me knowing him for a very long time, having a relationship with him, a working relationship, right? He was a good guy. I rented my house to him without having a written contract. This was everything was just verbal agreements. And I say it was a bad decision because, again, like I mentioned early on in the video, anytime you have any type of business agreement, business deal, particularly when you're talking about real estate, you should have a written contract. Don't do verbal agreements, all right? Now, I know verbal agreements can be or are legally binding. I don't know if it's that way in every state, but it probably is. Verbal agreements can be legally binding. However, it's much more challenging to prove compared to a written contract. So forget the verbal agreement stuff. You want to have documentation, man, when you're talking about going into business. Particularly in this case, we're talking about real estate. And that was one of the mistakes I made, just naive at the time, and really, trusting people. Now back to my tenant, my former boss, or manager. I don't like to call my superiors boss. Back to my former manager. I didn't have any issues with my former manager, right? Paid on time for the most part. I think he was probably late with payments one time. And he actually informed me ahead of time. He had some stuff going on. He informed me that he was going to be late, and, it was okay. He actually gave me a late fee for being late. So he paid $50 more than what his rent was due to the fact that he was late, which is what, most apartments or any place that you rent, you guys know if you've ever rented a place before, you get charged a late fee. Now 50 was light. I mean, when I rented my apartment, it was $100 late fee after like the third day. Like if you were 3 days late, they charge you $100. And I think it was like $100 every day after that third day, you will be charged a late fee. So you definitely didn't want to be late. But anyway, I didn't have any issues with him. He stayed in my house for a year. And then he decided to move. He actually moved to another state and got a promotion, right? So he was moving. When he moved, I had a friend of mine. We grew up together. He wanted to rent the house out. So I'm like, okay, cool. It was the same type of verbal agreement. This is the date you pay the rent, and this is the amount that needs to be paid at this time. This is where the issues started happening. My friend, he paid rent on time for probably about maybe 6 months or so. 6, maybe 7 months. I didn't have any issues. But then after that, we started having problems. And what's crazy about this situation is the fact that we actually worked together. I was the manager, he was my assistant. So I knew how much money he made. I knew when he was getting paid. Of course, I did payroll. This was the craziest thing. And so, you know, in my office, we would sit directly across from each other and everything, talk about whatever, right? And so I knew he was having some problems. You know, it's life. We all have certain things that we go through. He was having some, you know, child support issues and just other stuff that everybody goes through, right? Anyway, to make a long story short, late payments start turning into not having all of the rent, to then turn into not having no money to pay rent. And that lasted for a couple months. But before I decided to say, that's it, enough is enough. And essentially I had to evict him. Now, of course, you know, it wasn't an eviction where a law enforcement got involved or anything like that, because it wasn't any documentation. So, you know, it didn't go to that extent. And I don't think it would have anyway. I mean, like I said, we were friends. And we were able to, you know, talk it out. You know what I mean? He knew he was wrong in the situation. And so, you know, he had to leave. You know, I gave him some time to get his stuff out or whatever and to move and all that type of stuff. But that really taught me a lesson, man. You know, our friendship after that kind of, you know, went through a hard patch. And, you know, luckily for me, you know, I'm a pretty level-headed guy at the end of the day. And things could have went left. Things could have definitely, you know, went a lot worse than it was, but it didn't. You know what I mean? We actually did end up kind of, you know, stop communicating as much after all that transpired. But, you know, eventually we got back on, you know, good terms. But it's situations like that, particularly when there's money involved and stuff like that, you know, a lot of friendships and relationships can really just be destroyed over that. And I really didn't want that to happen with us, being that, you know, we've known each other since we were, you know, kids and stuff like that. And so it was a learning lesson for me at the end of the day. You know, I thought it was really messed up, being that, you know, we were so close as friends. In addition to that, you know, I still had a mortgage on my house. So it put me in a financial hardship as well, because I was having to pay the rent and all my utilities where I lived out of state. And I also had to pay my mortgage on the place that he was living in. So I was very, very, very unhappy about that whole situation. So, you know, I had to get him out of there immediately, man, because now, you know, it's not like I'm not gonna pay the money, because I don't want my house to go in foreclosure, and I don't want to ruin my credit. My credit's good. I've, you know, always made on-time payments with my mortgage and all that type of stuff. So, you know, it was a tough situation, man, but it really taught me to never do business with friends again. And, you know, it's sad that it has to be like that sometimes. And I know a lot of people, friends in particular, go in business together all the time. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But for me personally, that was just a lesson learned for me going forward. When it has something to do about business, it's got to have some written contracts involved. You know, I can't go in business with anybody just off a verbal agreement. You know what I mean? No matter how long I've known the person, doesn't matter if you're a family member, a sibling, anything like that. If it's business, we gotta put it on paper. You know what I mean? We gotta have some documentation. And I would advise anybody that's going into business with somebody, I don't care how close you are, you need to put it on paper. You need to have documentation, man, written contracts, because if you guys have a falling out or what have you, and you have to go to court, you want to be able to provide some documentation and not just, you know, some he said, she said, you know, something verbal. But again, this is what I talk about on my channel when I talk about bad decisions. You know, that was a bad decision. And we make bad decisions in life. And a lot of times, you know, we have to accept the consequences. And sometimes you just have to learn from it and hopefully not make the same decision in the future. And that was definitely a lesson for me to learn. And it cost me money, right? Having to pay my mortgage with somebody else living in my property, that was money out of my pocket. Prior to that, you know, everything was good. I was getting, you know, some nice little passive income coming in and everything was sweet. But yeah, man, that taught me a lesson. So that was definitely one of the worst decisions I've made in terms of business, and I'll never do it again. I'll never do it again, man. So I just wanted to share that with you guys today. Let me know if you made a similar mistake or a bad decision. Drop it in the comments. Let me know. I'm curious to hear from you guys. Look, man, until the next video, I'll catch you guys later, man. Peace.